Coffee and Cardamom in a Witch's Café. Welcome to Fantasy Journeys. Tonight, snow is falling on Porvoo, a beautiful historic city in southern Finland. Not the heavy kind, the quiet kind, the kind that arrives without announcement and covers everything it finds with the same patient indifference. Outside, the old town is settling into blue dark, the wooden houses along the river holding their amber light close, the cobblestones disappearing one by one beneath a thin white hush. If you like, let your shoulders drop. Let the cold stay outside where it belongs. There is nowhere you need to be tonight. Only here. Only this. A small note before we begin. The cafes of Porvoo are known for their cardamom coffee. It is said that cardamom in Finnish coffee is not a flavoring. It is simply what coffee is. No one questions it. Some things are better that way. Now, relax and enjoy, and let us begin our journey together. Chapter 1. The Old Town Before Dark. The cold in Porvoo in December was not the cold of other places. Luca had been in cold cities before. He knew the wet cold of Amsterdam in November, the grey cold of London in February, the sharp cold of mountain towns that bit at the ears and moved on. But this was different. This cold was dry and very still, and it had a smell, clean stone and something underneath it, older than stone, the particular scent of air that had been frozen and thawed and frozen again across more winters than anyone had counted. It didn't push against him. It simply was. The way the dark was simply there, settled and unhurried, and not especially concerned with his presence. He had arrived in Porvoo that afternoon on the bus from Helsinki, and he had been walking ever since. There was no itinerary. There rarely was when Luca travelled alone. He had learned over the years that the itinerary was the first thing to go, usually within the first hour of arriving somewhere, when the actual texture of a place made itself known and turned out to be entirely different from what the photographs had suggested. Porvoo's photographs had suggested charm. The reality was something quieter than charm. The old town sat on a low hill above the river, like something that had simply always been there and saw no reason to make a fuss about it. The wooden houses painted in faded reds and ochres, and the grey-green of lichen, the narrow streets tilting slightly in the way of streets that were laid before anyone thought to use a level. He crossed a small bridge. Below, the river was dark and carried a thin skin of ice along its edges, not enough to walk on, only enough to catch the light from the lamps on the embankment and hold it in long fractured shapes. A woman in a fur-trimmed coat walked past him on the bridge without looking up. Somewhere ahead, a church bell marked the hour. He counted 4, then lost track, then decided it didn't matter. The lampposts along the embankment were old iron, curved at the top, and they had come on while he wasn't paying attention. He noticed this only when he looked up from the ice and found the street ahead of him, transformed into something out of a painting. The warm gold of the lamps against the blue-grey of the winter sky, the snow falling through the light in slow, unhurried diagonals, the red walls of the houses on either side, holding the lamplight in their wood grain, like something absorbed over centuries. He stood still for a moment. He didn't always do that, stand still and simply look. At home, there was always somewhere to be, always the particular restlessness of a person who had too many half-finished thoughts waiting for him. But here, on a bridge in a small Finnish town in December, with the river going dark below and the snow coming down through the lamplight, the half-finished thoughts were very far away. He breathed in. The cold filled his lungs cleanly, without resistance. Then he kept walking, because the cold was also, eventually, cold. He turned off the embankment into one of the side streets that climbed the hill, following no particular logic. The streets here were narrow enough that the houses on either side nearly touched overhead, and the snow that had accumulated on the eaves fell in occasional small curtains as the wind shifted. His boots on the cobblestones made a sound that satisfied him in some way he couldn't have named, a solid, unhurried sound. The sound of a person going somewhere at a pace that made sense. He was thinking vaguely about coffee. Not about any particular cafe. Just about coffee in the abstract, about warmth and something to hold in both hands, about sitting down. His feet had been on cobblestones for 2 hours, and the cold had worked its way through the soles of his boots in the patient, methodical way that cold always did, starting at the toes and moving inward. He had passed 2 cafes on the main street earlier, both with their lights on and their windows fogged with warmth, and he had not stopped at either. Not for any reason he could articulate. They had looked fine. They had looked like cafes. But he had kept walking, and now he was up in the old streets where the lamps were fewer, and the houses pressed closer together, and the coffee remained theoretical. He turned a corner. The street narrowed further here, into something that was more accurately a lane, or perhaps simply a gap between 2 rows of buildings that had been used as a street long enough to become one. He wasn't sure he had been down this way before. He thought he had covered most of the old town by now, but the lanes in Porvoo had a way of rearranging themselves slightly between visits, or at least of presenting different aspects of themselves, depending on the light. In summer, it would be one thing. In December, at the hour when the dark had fully arrived, the cobblestones slick with the thin film of new snow, the lane was something else, narrower and more quiet, the kind of quiet that had texture to it. He was about to turn back when he saw the light. It came from the end of the lane, from what he had assumed was simply the blank end of a building, the dead end he'd been walking toward without quite acknowledging. But there was light there, a warm light, amber and very steady. Not the blue-white of a modern interior, but something older in its color, like the light from a fire or from bulbs that were not made to be especially efficient, only to glow. And with the light, as he took another step toward it, came the smell. Cardamom, unmistakably, and underneath it something else, something warm and slightly resinous, the smell of old wood and of something being heated slowly in a pan, the smell of a kitchen that had been in use for a very long time. Luca slowed. He hadn't, until this moment, noticed how quiet the lane was. His own footsteps on the snow-covered cobblestones were the only sound, not even wind, the buildings on either side blocking it completely. The smell of cardamom was very clear now. It was not a smell that drifted and faded the way outdoor smells did. It was a smell that held its position, as though it was coming from a specific and deliberate source. He took another step. At the end of the lane, set into the wall of a low building whose upper story disappeared into the dark, was a door. Dark wood, iron fittings, a small window of old glass beside it, the kind of glass that had tiny imperfections in it, bubbles and slight thickenings that distorted the view through it in a way that modern glass did not. Through that imperfect glass, the amber light was very warm. There was a shape moving inside, something slow and unhurried. Above the door, a wooden sign hung from an iron bracket. The letters on it were carved by hand, deep and clean, but in the snow light, Luca couldn't read them. He stepped closer. The characters were not Finnish, or perhaps they were Finnish, but an older form of it. The letters slightly different from what he knew. He looked at them for a moment, and then stopped trying to read them, because the cardamom smell was very close now, and the cold was in his feet, and the light from the small window was very warm. He didn't think about it especially. He just reached out and tried the door. It opened. The warmth came out to meet him before he had fully crossed the threshold, a warmth that had texture and weight to it, layered and slow, the warmth of a room that had been warm for a long time. He stepped inside. Behind him, the door swung shut with a sound that was barely a sound, just the softest compression of air, and then the snow and the quiet lane were gone. Chapter 2: A Door That Didn't Need a Sign. The first thing Luca noticed was that the room was larger than it should have been. He knew this the way you knew certain things in dreams, not through calculation, but through a quiet certainty that arrived without announcing itself. The building from outside had been narrow, a single frontage pressed between its neighbors, barely wider than the door itself. But the room he was standing in now had space in it. Real space, the kind that allowed the eye to travel and arrive somewhere, rather than stopping immediately at a wall. He looked up. The ceiling was high, crossed by dark wooden beams, and from each beam hung something different. A cluster of dried herbs here, a string of small glass orbs there that caught the firelight and redistributed it in tiny warm points across the plaster above. He looked to his left and right and found that the room extended in both directions, further than the exterior had suggested was possible, tapering at the far ends into a comfortable dimness that felt less like emptiness and more like privacy. He thought briefly of a coat cupboard he'd found as a child in his grandmother's house that turned out to have a second room behind it, used for storing things no one remembered storing. The memory arrived and departed in roughly the same moment. The floor was wide planked wood, the color of dark honey, worn smooth in the middle of the room where feet had passed for years or decades or longer and left rougher and more textured near the walls. There were perhaps 8 or 9 tables, none of them matching, some round, some square, one long and narrow that ran parallel to the left-hand wall, its surface covered in a cloth of deep burgundy, with a pattern that Luca couldn't quite follow when he looked at it directly, only catching it in his peripheral vision. Each table had a candle on it, and each candle was burning, and the combined effect of all those small flames on all that dark wood and warm plaster was the color that lived somewhere between amber and gold, a color that Luca associated with late Sunday afternoons in autumn, with the particular quality of light just before it decided to become evening. He stood just inside the door and let his eyes adjust. On the walls, maps, large ones, framed in thin dark wood, hung at various heights with the casual confidence of things that had been in place for a long time. He looked at the nearest one, a coastline, detailed and carefully drawn, with names in careful old lettering, marking towns and capes and river mouths. He leaned slightly closer. The coastline was not one he recognized, not in the way of being unable to place it immediately, but in the way of being genuinely unlike any geography he knew. The curve of it wrong for any sea he could name, the proportions of the landmass behind it unfamiliar. The town names were in a script he couldn't identify. He looked at a second map, further along the wall, also unfamiliar, also detailed, also clearly the work of someone who had been somewhere and drawn what they had found. He was still looking at the maps when a voice said, from somewhere behind the counter to his right, "Sit wherever you like. There are no bad seats." Luca turned. The woman behind the counter had not been there a moment ago, or if she had been still enough to be part of the background, indistinguishable from the shelves behind her. She was standing with her hands resting lightly on the counter's edge, watching him with an expression that was attentive without being intrusive, the way a person looked at something they were genuinely interested in, but had no intention of disturbing. She was. He found himself pausing on this, which he almost never did. She was difficult to look away from, not in the way of someone performing their appearance, not striking in any curated or deliberate sense. It was something else. Her hair was very pale, almost white, and she had gathered it loosely in a way that he associated with old paintings rather than anything contemporary. Not precisely braided, not precisely pinned, but arranged in some fashion that kept it off her face with the ease of long practice. Her clothes were dark green wool, long-sleeved, the cuffs and collar edged with something gold that caught the candlelight. Around her neck, a chain of silver with small pendants that moved when she moved. He couldn't see what they were from here. Her age was impossible to determine. Not young, not old, somewhere in between those categories, in a way that made the categories feel insufficient. She was looking at him with something that was almost amusement, but warmer than amusement, more like recognition. "I thought you would be later," she said. Her Finnish accent in English was light, musical. The words themselves were odd. Luca had never been here before, had not told anyone he was coming, had not in fact known he was coming himself until 20 minutes ago, when he had turned into a lane he had not planned to enter. He opened his mouth to say something and found reasonably that he had nothing useful to say. She smiled, a small one, directed more at herself than at him. "Sit," she said again, kindly. "I'll bring something warm." Luca sat. He chose a table near the fire, a proper fireplace, deep set into the right-hand wall, with an iron grate and real wood burning in it. The kind of fire that did not need tending at this particular moment, but that clearly had been tended carefully to reach this state of steady, even burning. The chair he pulled out was high-backed and upholstered in a fabric the color of dried moss, and when he sat in it, the chair received him with the specific accommodation of furniture that had been sat in by many people for a long time. The slight give in exactly the right places, the angle of the back perfectly calibrated to the angle of a person deciding to stop moving. He settled in and looked at the chair across the table from him. It was a different chair, lower backed, upholstered in something that had once been burgundy and was now the color of a very old burgundy, faded unevenly in the way of things that had seen a great deal of light. The wear patterns on both chairs were distinctive, particular to each, as though they had each been sat in by specific and regular occupants over a long period. But the fabric, when he looked closely, was not worn in the way of old fabric. It was whole, unfrayed, without the pills or thin patches of genuinely aged upholstery, new fabric on a very old frame, or fabric that had been old and was somehow not showing it. He decided not to think about this especially. From where he sat, he could see most of the room. There were 4 other occupied tables. At the long table against the left wall, an old man was reading, or rather was sitting with a book open in front of him, though he appeared less to be reading it in the ordinary sense, and more to be in some kind of correspondence with it, the pages moving occasionally without his hands going near them, turning one by one in the way of pages moved by a draft, except there was no draft. He wore a coat that was too large for him, and a hat with a brim wide enough to cast his face into a comfortable shadow, and he had the quality of certain old men of being entirely at peace with where he was, in the way that came not from contentment necessarily, but from a very long familiarity with existing in a body in a room. Near the window, the small pane of old glass that Luca had looked through from outside, a young woman was sitting with her arm resting on the sill, drawing something on the surface of the table with her index finger. The drawings appeared briefly in faint lines of light and then faded, like breath on cold glass, like the trace of something almost said. She was entirely absorbed in this. She did not look up. At a round table near the fireplace, close enough that Luca could have heard them clearly if they had been speaking at a normal volume, 2 people sat opposite each other over a low board, not a chessboard. The board was darker and divided differently, and instead of chess pieces, it held perhaps 20 small stones that emitted in the firelight a glow that was just barely more than the reflection of the fire could account for. The 2 players, a man with very red hair pulled back simply, and a woman whose coat appeared to have small embroidered animals moving along its hem, though Luca did not look long enough to be certain, moved the stones with great deliberateness and smiled at each other after each move with the private satisfaction of people sharing something they found genuinely good. The last occupied table was at the back of the room, in the comfortable dimness near the end wall. A couple sat there, their heads close together. Luca could not see their faces from here, but he could hear them. Not their words, only the pattern of their voices, which moved in and out of speaking in a rhythm that was almost musical, or perhaps was musical, shifting without quite becoming song, and then settling back into speech with the naturalness of a river around a stone. The woman behind the counter appeared at his table without Luca having heard her approach. She set down a cup. The cup was made of pottery, cream-colored, with a small crack along one side that had been filled with something the color of dried gold. Not filled exactly, sealed, in the way of kintsugi, but less precise than the kintsugi Luca had seen in photographs, as though it had been done by hand by someone who understood the principle and cared about the cup more than about the technique. "What is this?" Luca asked, looking at the cup. He meant the drink. The color of it was not quite right for any coffee he had seen, carrying in its darkness a very faint redness when the firelight caught it directly. "Coffee," she said. And then, after a pause that felt considered rather than hesitant, "Mostly." She moved away before he could ask anything else, back toward the counter with the same quality of movement she had had before. Not slow exactly, not hurried, only absolutely unhurried, the movement of someone who had somewhere to be and was entirely content that they would arrive there. Luca looked at the cup for a moment. The smell coming from it was cardamom, clear and warm, and beneath the cardamom, something else that he could not place, something that was not a spice he knew the name of, but that he associated, for no reason he could explain, with mornings when he had woken up somewhere new and felt, before he was fully conscious, the specific quiet pleasure of not yet knowing what the day would contain. He wrapped both hands around the cup. The warmth came through the pottery immediately, moving into his palms and along his fingers with the thoroughness of something that had been waiting to do exactly this. Outside, the snow was still falling against the old glass of the window, visible in the lamplight from the lane, each flake catching the light briefly and then descending out of it, replaced immediately by another. The fire settled in the grate with a soft sound, a minor rearrangement of wood, and then went on burning as it had been. Luca brought the cup to his lips. He was not yet prepared for what happened next, but that, he would think much later, was rather the point. Chapter 3. The Best Cup of Anything. The first sip was not what he expected. He had expected good coffee. The cardamom smell alone had promised that much, and the warmth of the cup in his hands had suggested something serious was inside it. He had expected, perhaps, the particular pleasure of a very good cup of coffee in a cold place, which was already one of the better pleasures available to a person on a winter evening. He had been prepared for that. He had lifted the cup, breathed in once more. The cardamom and the thing beneath it, the warm resinous thing without a name. And he had taken the first sip with the modest expectations of a person who had learned not to set the bar too high. What happened instead was this. Every other cup of coffee he had ever drunk became in that moment a rough draft. It was not that the flavor was extreme. It was not intensely sweet or intensely bitter or intensely anything. It was that it was exactly right, in a way that he had no framework to describe, because exact rightness in a cup of coffee was not a category he had previously encountered. The cardamom was there but not dominant, present the way a good accompanist was present, supporting, completing, never overtaking. Beneath it, the coffee itself had a depth that unfolded in sequence. First something dark and smooth, then something that was almost chocolate, but not chocolate, and then, at the very back of the palate, as the warmth moved down, something he genuinely could not identify. Not a spice, not a sweetener, something older than either of those categories, something that tasted less like an ingredient and more like a condition. like the flavor of a room that had been warm for a very long time, distilled somehow into liquid. He set the cup down. He looked at it. The faint redness he had noticed earlier was still there in the depths when the firelight caught it at the right angle. Not red like fruit, not red like wine, but the very dark red of embers seen through glass. The color of something still burning quietly inside. He picked the cup up again and held it without drinking. Just held it and thought about nothing in particular. This was unusual for him. At home, at the cafe near his office, where he stopped every morning, he drank his coffee while doing something else, reading, checking his phone, preparing himself mentally for whatever the day intended. The coffee there was fine. He had never once held it with both hands and thought about nothing. He held this cup and thought about nothing, and it was not an absence, but a fullness. The way silence in a good room was not empty, but inhabited, after a while. He couldn't have said how long. The firelight made time approximate. He set the cup down again and looked properly at the room. The shelves behind the counter were the first thing that held his attention. They ran the full width of the back wall, floor to ceiling, and they were full, not cluttered, full in the way of a library that had been organized by someone with a system that was internally coherent, even if it was not immediately legible to an outsider. There were jars, many jars, of varying sizes, some clear glass, and some the dark green-brown of old apothecary bottles, each with a small label, handwritten in the same script as the sign outside the door. Whatever was inside them was not immediately identifiable. Powders and dried things and liquids of colors that did not correspond to any ingredient Luca could name with confidence. One jar near the middle of the second shelf held something that was a very deep violet and appeared, when the light moved, to shift slightly within the glass. Not boiling, not moving, only giving the impression of having an interior weather. He looked at it for a while and then looked at the jar beside it, which held something pale gold and completely still, and which smelled, or seemed to smell from this distance, of something cut from a forest. Between the jars, other things, a mortar and pestle of dark stone, a small set of scales with brass weights arranged in descending size on a cloth beside them, a bundle of something dried and tied with brown string, hanging from a hook on the underside of the second highest shelf, a book, open and face down, its spine upward, the pages slightly fanned. The book was very thick, and its cover was a material that was not quite leather and not quite cloth, and that caught the firelight in a way that fabric did not usually catch light. The woman moved behind the counter with the ease of someone operating in a space they knew entirely, not looking at the shelves to find things, reaching without looking, and finding what she reached for. She was preparing something. He couldn't see exactly what. The angle was wrong, only the movements of her hands visible above the counter's edge. Small movements, precise. The pendants on her chain swung slightly as she worked. He looked at the maps again from his new angle. From the fireplace table he could see a third map he hadn't noticed before, hung on the wall at the far end of the room, near the couple whose voices moved in and out of music. This one was different from the others. Larger and drawn in a different hand, looser and more suggestive. The coastlines sketched rather than measured. The interior of the landmass it showed was filled with small illustrations, a mountain range rendered in careful diagonal lines, what appeared to be a forest indicated by rows of tiny trees, a river system that spread across the lower portion of the map like a hand opening. In the upper right corner, where cartographers traditionally placed their compass roses, there was instead a small drawing of something that might have been a bird, or might have been something else. The detail was too fine to read from here. He found he wanted to get up and look at it more closely. He did not get up. The chair was too good, and the coffee was too warm, and there was something about the room that made standing up feel like a proposition requiring more energy than he currently wished to spend. Not lethargy, not the leaden heaviness of tiredness, but something more like the physical sense of being correctly placed, of fitting into a space in the same way a book fitted into the specific gap on a shelf it had come from. He was thinking this, or not quite thinking it, having it the way you had certain things in a comfortable room, at the edge of thought rather than inside it, when the smell changed slightly. Not the cardamom. That was still there, steady and warm. But something else had been added to the air. Something sweet and slightly caramelized, with an undertone of something almost floral, almost smoky, occupying both categories partially without fully committing to either. It was the smell of something being prepared, something that involved heat and patience, and an ingredient he did not recognize. His cup, he noticed, was still half full. He was almost certain he had drunk more of it than that. He thought back through the last, however long it had been, and counted the sips he could remember taking, and the arithmetic did not quite work out in favor of a half-full cup. He looked at it again. Half full. The faint redness in the depths when the firelight caught it at the right angle. He decided on reflection not to count sips anymore. From the table near the window, the young woman who had been drawing with her finger looked up for the first time. She looked at Luca with eyes that were very dark and very interested, the way a person looked at something they had been thinking about before the thing itself arrived. She did not smile exactly, but there was something in her expression that was warm in the direction of a smile, an acknowledgement, a recognition, the slight softening of a face that had decided the person across the room was acceptable. Then she looked back down at the table and resumed her drawing, her finger moving in small, careful arcs across the wood, the faint lines appearing and fading as before. Luca watched the lines appear and fade. They were not random. He could see that now. They had structure, repetition, the internal logic of something that was either written or drawn, occupying a space between those two things. A line would appear, curve, branch into two, then one of the branches would fade before the other, and the remaining branch would continue into a new configuration. He watched this for a while, trying to find the system, and then stopped trying to find the system, because looking for the system was less pleasant than simply watching the lines appear and fade and appear again, and he was becoming, in this room, a person who preferred the second option. The couple at the back table had stopped speaking. Now they were only sitting, their heads still close together, their hands resting on the table between them, in an arrangement that was not quite holding hands, and not quite not. The two of them sharing the comfortable silence of people who had been together long enough, that silence required no filling. Luca felt, watching them, something he could not immediately name. Not loneliness, not its opposite either, something adjacent to both. The feeling of being in the presence of a warmth that was not directed at you, but that warmed you anyway, the way a fire warmed a room rather than a person. He drank more of his coffee. It was still the right temperature. This was objectively impossible. He had been sitting with it for some time now, in a room that was warm, but not so warm that a hot liquid would have held its heat this long. But it was the right temperature, and the taste was what it had been, and the faint red in the depths, when the firelight caught it, was where it had always been. He found he was smiling slightly, not at anything, only at the cup and the fire, and the warm press of the chair at his back, and the particular quality of the room that he still had not found a word for. Not magic. That word was too large and too imprecise, and suggested things that were not true of this place. The room was not dramatic. It was not spectacular. It was something more difficult to name and more difficult to find. It was exactly itself, in the same way that the coffee had been exactly right, in the way of things that had been made with such specificity of attention that they could not be mistaken for anything other than what they were. He set the cup down in its small saucer, the saucer the same cream pottery as the cup, with the same quality of having been used and cared for across a long period, and looked at the small crack along the side of the cup again. The gold in the crack caught the candlelight from the small candle at his table and held it, a thin seam of warm light running through the pottery. Beside him, at the very edge of his table, he noticed for the first time a small object he had not seen placed there, a sprig of something dried, laid parallel to the table's edge, a herb of some kind, fine-stemmed, with small dried flowers along it that were the color of very old ivory. He had not heard anyone put it there. He did not know when it had appeared. He left it where it was. It seemed happy there. The fire settled again in the grate, a slow rearrangement, deeply unhurried. Outside, the snow was still coming down through the lamplight in the lane, patient and methodical, covering things over one thin layer at a time. Luca picked up his cup again. Chapter 4. The People Who Stayed. The old man turned a page without touching it. Luca saw this clearly, had been watching the old man for a minute or two from across the room, watching in the unfocused way you watch things in a warm room after a good cup of something, not examining, but simply receiving. And the page turned on its own, not blown by a draught, not nudged by a sleeve. The old man's hands were resting flat on the table on either side of the book, and the page lifted, moved through its arc with the deliberateness of a page that knew where it was going, and settled on the other side. The old man did not react. He read the new page, or whatever he was doing, which resembled reading the way certain things resembled other things without quite being them, with the same undisturbed attention he had brought to the previous one. Luca looked down at his cup, then back at the old man. The hat was extraordinary, wide-brimmed, a deep brown that had gone darker at the creases from long use, the brim slightly uneven in the way of felt hats that had been rained on many times and dried many times, and had arrived through this process at a shape that was entirely their own. Under the brim, The old man's face was mostly shadow, but Luca could see the white of his hair where it emerged below the hat's edge and fell to his collar. Very white, the white of snow in shadow rather than snow in sun, and very straight. His coat was large, as Luca had noted before, but it was not a coat that had always been large. It was a coat that had been fitted to someone, and then that someone had become smaller over time. Or perhaps the coat had simply expanded in the patient way of old wool, making room for itself. The cuffs extended past the old man's wrists entirely, and he did not seem to notice or mind. Another page turned. Luca decided, not as a decision exactly, more as the natural endpoint of watching something interesting long enough, to look somewhere else before the old man caught him staring. He shifted his gaze to the couple near the fireplace and the board of glowing stones. They were still playing, if playing was the right word for it. Each move was considered at length. The red-haired man would look at the board, look at the woman across from him, look at the board again, and then lift a stone between his thumb and forefinger and move it with the care of someone handling something that mattered. The woman watched each move with a slight tilt of her head that suggested she was not calculating a response so much as listening to the move the way you listen to a piece of music, for what it said, not what it required. Her coat was dark, the color of a deep forest at midday, and the embroidery along the hem, which Luca looked at now, more carefully, was not animals moving, he realized, or not only animals. There were figures in it, very small, very detailed, worked in thread the color of copper and old gold. A person walking, a tree, something with wings too small to identify, a boat on water. He could not tell if the figures were always the same or if they changed between glances. He decided again not to look too systematically. He was still looking at the coat when the singing started. It came from behind him, from the direction of the table at the back, where the couple had been sitting in their shared silence. He turned and found that the silence had become something else. The woman had begun to sing very softly, in a voice that was low and even, and moved through its notes with the unhurried ease of water finding its way downhill. Her companion, a man, Luca could see now, dark-haired and with the kind of broad, calm face that belonged to people who were comfortable taking up space in a room, was not singing, but was providing something under her melody, a low humming that was less a harmony than a foundation, the way certain instruments existed, not to be heard separately, but to make the air ready for what came above them. The song was in no language Luca recognized. He was fairly certain of this. He spoke 3 languages passably, and had heard enough of several others to recognize their shapes, their characteristic sounds and rhythms, and this was none of them. The vowels were very long, longer than in most languages, and the consonants were few and mostly soft, and the whole of it moved in a pattern that was not quite like Western melody, and not quite unlike it, something adjacent to both, coming from the direction of something older than either. And yet, he knew it, not the words, not the structure, but some quality underneath those things, something in the relationship between the notes and the silences between them. It was the way certain smells brought back, not a specific memory, but the feeling of a period of life before the specifics attached. The song did not remind him of any song he could name. but it reminded him of something. He couldn't get closer to it than that. He was not aware until he noticed his hand that he had begun tapping, very softly. His right hand resting on the table, 2 fingers finding the rhythm of the melody and marking it against the wood with no more sound than a heartbeat. He noticed this and stopped, with the slight self-consciousness of a person caught doing something private in a public place. But before he could withdraw his hand entirely, the woman at the back table looked up. She found his eyes immediately, the way people did when they already knew where to look. Her face in the candlelight was. He would have difficulty later reconstructing it exactly, which was unusual for him. He had a good memory for faces, but hers seemed to shift slightly depending on the angle of the light, or perhaps depending on what she was doing with it. When she looked up at him now, it held an expression that was open and warm, and specifically amused, the amusement of someone who had expected exactly this and found the actual occurrence of it pleasing in proportion to the expectation. She nodded at his hand, meaning clearly, "Go on." Luca hesitated for a moment in the way of a person choosing between 2 versions of himself, the version that declined politely and felt comfortable, and the version that did not decline. Then he put his fingers back on the table and found the rhythm again, and the woman's expression shifted into something warmer, and she went back to her song. The man beside her glanced at Luca over her head and gave a single slow nod, not approval exactly, more like the acknowledgement of a person who had been expecting a guest and was glad the guest had arrived in reasonable shape. Then he returned to his humming, and the 2 of them and Luca's barely audible tapping on the table existed together for a while, in a configuration that was not quite music and not quite not, somewhere between participation and witnessing, in a room where the fire burned and the candles held their flames very still. The song ended, or rather it didn't end so much as gradually stop. The last note held until it wasn't held anymore, dissolving into the ambient sound of the room the way a drop of ink dissolved in water, the boundary between it and the silence becoming indistinct and then gone. Luca lifted his fingers from the table. The man with red hair at the stone board made a move. His companion looked at it for a long time, smiling. Then a sound came from the window table, a small clear sound, like a finger tapped once on glass, and Luca looked to find the young woman who drew with her fingers watching him. She had the directness of very young people and also of certain old people, the directness of those who had either not yet learned that looking openly at someone was considered impolite, or had learned this and decided it wasn't true. Her dark eyes were interested and wholly unguarded. She pointed at the table in front of him. He looked. The table was plain wood, old, honey dark, the same wood as the floor. He looked back at her. She pointed again, more specifically, at a point on the table surface, roughly in the center. He leaned forward. There was something there that had not been there before, a small drawing, faint as breath on glass, in the style of hers. The same thin lines appearing and slowly fading. He looked at it before it was gone. A figure, very small, sitting in a chair in front of a fire with a cup in its hands. The proportions were slightly exaggerated in the way of a caricature. The chair a little grander, the cup a little larger. the fire a little warmer than any fire had a right to be, but recognizable, clearly, specifically, him. He looked up at the young woman. She had already returned to her own table, her finger moving in its careful arcs across the wood, her expression entirely absorbed. He looked back at his table. The drawing was almost gone. Just the chair still visible, the merest suggestion of a person in it, and then that too faded, and the wood was plain again. He sat back. The fire in the grate put out a warmth that reached exactly this far and no further, and he was sitting exactly at its edge, which was the ideal position, close enough to feel it on the left side of his face and the left side of his hands, far enough that it was warmth rather than heat. He had not planned to sit this close to the fire. He had chosen the table because it was near the fire, which was not quite the same thing. The specific position within it, the precise angle, had simply turned out to be correct. The woman behind the counter moved into view briefly, carrying something to the couple at the back table. She moved the way she always moved, without apparent hurry, and as she passed his table, she glanced at him in the manner of someone checking on something they had set in motion and finding it proceeding as expected. She did not stop, but as she passed, she said very quietly, not quite to him and not quite not, "The cardamom coffee here is made with the green pods, the ones they don't export." She was gone before he could respond. He looked at his cup. He knew very little about cardamom specifically. He knew it was a spice. He knew it was in certain things. He knew it smelled like this. He did not know about green pods as opposed to any other kind. But something about the way she had said it, the ones they don't export, settled in him like an answer to a question he hadn't known he was carrying, and he felt, oddly, satisfied. The old man at the long table turned another page. The red-haired man placed a stone, and the woman across from him made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh, and was, Luca suspected, a sound unique to this particular game and this particular relationship with it. A sound that had been developed over a long period of playing and had no application elsewhere. Outside, the snow was thicker now against the old glass of the window. He could see it when the lamplight in the lane caught it, falling faster than before, the flakes larger, the lane slowly going white. Inside, the candle on his table burned without flickering. The sprig of dried herb at the edge of his table was still there, pale and fine-stemmed, its small ivory flowers very still. He was warm. He was in the specific way of this room and this chair and this fire and this inexplicable cup that was still the right temperature, exactly where he was. Not metaphorically, physically. The soles of his feet, which had been cold since the bridge, were no longer cold. The back of his neck, which carried tension with the loyalty of an old habit, was not carrying it tonight. His shoulders were at a height that was simply their natural height, not the slightly elevated height they occupied in the rest of his life. He did not think about any of this consciously. He only noticed, in the peripheral way of noticing things in rooms like this, that he had stopped being any of the things he usually was when he was somewhere, and had become instead only a person in a chair, in a warm room, with a cup of coffee that was still the right temperature, and a fire that knew what it was doing, and outside the snow falling through a lamplight he could see from where he was sitting, and it was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was, he would think later. Much later, in a different kind of room, in a different kind of light, possibly everything. He drank the last of his coffee. When he lowered the cup, Aino was already moving toward him from behind the counter, and in her hands was something he had not ordered and had not seen on any menu, and could not have named if asked, and the smell coming from it was the smell that had been moving through the air for the last little while, sweet and caramelized, and almost floral, and almost smoky, and entirely its own. She set it down in front of him without a word, and looked at him with the expression she had been wearing since he arrived, the expression of someone who had been expecting him. Chapter 5. Second cup, something warm, with honey and stone. He looked at what she had set in front of him for a moment before touching it. It was on a small plate of the same cream pottery as the cup, a piece of something, roughly the size and shape of a generous slice of bread, but denser, darker, the surface of it irregular in the way of things baked without a mold, following the logic of their own ingredients rather than the logic of a pan. The color was deep amber brown, with a slight sheen on the surface that caught the candlelight the way certain wood finished with oil caught light, not glossy, only present. Around it on the plate, a small amount of something had pooled. Honey, perhaps, or something in the honey family. The color of it darker than commercial honey and less uniform, varying from gold to almost brown in the same small pool. He could not identify the smell. That was the honest truth of it. He could identify components. Something warm and grain adjacent, something floral and very faint, something that sat at the edge of what he associated with spice, but did not commit to any specific spice he could name. But the combination of these things produced a smell that was its own entity, not reducible to its parts, in the same way that the coffee had been not reducible to cardamom and darkness and the unnamed thing beneath. He broke off a small piece with his fingers. The texture was not what he expected, not the crumb of bread or cake, but something between the two, and also somehow neither, closer perhaps to the texture of something that had been compressed and then allowed to set, layered internally in a way that the outside did not suggest. It was warm, genuinely warm, not the residual warmth of something recently baked, but the active warmth of something that was maintaining its temperature with the same quiet insistence as his coffee cup. He put it in his mouth. What happened was not dramatic. It was almost the opposite of dramatic. It was a settling, a quieting, as though something that had been running at a slightly higher register than necessary had been gently brought down to the correct level. Sweetness, yes. The honey note, fuller in the mouth than in the smell. And beneath it something earthy and deep. And beneath that, something he had absolutely no category for. Something that tasted the way the smell of old stone felt when you encountered it in a basement or a cathedral. The taste of somewhere that had been the same for a very long time, and then all of it faded cleanly, leaving only warmth, and the warmth stayed. He sat with it for a moment. He had been going to think about something. He was nearly certain of this. There had been something at the back of his mind when he lifted the cup earlier, some half-formed thought he'd been carrying since before he came in, some item from the ordinary running inventory of a person's day. He reached for it now and found he could not locate it, not in the way of forgetting, which had a texture to it, a sense of absence, more in the way of a room being tidy, everything put away correctly, nothing missing, only the surface clear and the air open. He broke off another piece. Across the room, the red-haired man looked up from the stone board and caught Luca's eye. He nodded at the plate with an expression that said, without any ambiguity, that he approved of Luca's choice, which had not been a choice at all. Luca nodded back. The man returned to the board. After a while, the plate half finished, the warmth from it still in his chest, the fire doing what it had been doing with complete consistency. The red-haired man stood up and stretched, and his companion gathered the glowing stones from the board with both hands and held them loosely, and the red-haired man looked across the room at Luca with the frank, uncomplicated friendliness of someone who lived in a world where approaching a stranger required no particular justification. He crossed the room with two of the stones held out in his open palm. "You want to try?" he said. His accent was not Finnish. Something further north, something with different vowels, though Luca could not place it precisely. His voice was easy, unhurried, the voice of a man who asked questions without caring very much about any particular answer. Luca looked at the stones in his palm. Up close, the glow was clearer, each stone roughly the size of a large hazelnut, smooth-surfaced, the kind of smooth that came from water rather than polishing, and the light inside them was not reflected light, not a trick of the firelight, but genuine and internal, a warmth of their own that was steady and very quiet, like the glow of something that had been left burning for a long time in a closed room. He picked one up. It was warm. He had expected this from looking at it, but the degree of warmth was more than he'd expected, and it was not the warmth of an object that had absorbed heat from an external source. It was the warmth of something that generated its own. "What is the game?" Luca asked. The man sat down in the chair across from him, not waiting to be invited, not asking, simply sitting in the way of people for whom the social mechanics of seating had long ceased to be a concern. He set the board down between them, which Luca had not noticed him carrying. The board was dark, almost black, and the divisions on it were not squares, but something closer to a constellation, irregular points connected by faint lines. His companion had remained at their table, resting her chin in her hand, watching with the comfortable interest of someone who had seen this before and still found it worth watching. "The stones need to stay lit," the man said. He arranged half of them on Luca's side of the board and half on his own. "If a stone goes dark, you warm it again." He demonstrated, cupped one of his stones briefly in both hands, breathed across it once, set it back. The stone, which had not been dim, now glowed fractionally brighter. That is the whole game. Luca looked at his stones, then at the board. How do you win? The man considered this question with genuine interest, as though it were not a stupid question, but simply one that required actual thought. "No one wins," he said finally. "The stones stay lit. That is the point." He paused. "Or they go dark and you warm them again." that is also the point. He moved one of his stones along a line to a new position on the board. The move had no apparent tactical logic that Luca could identify, but it seemed to satisfy the man. Luca looked at his own stones for a moment, at the small, steady warmth of them in the candlelight, and then picked one up and moved it. The man across from him nodded as though Luca had made an excellent decision, which was impossible to evaluate given the circumstances. They played for a while in a silence that was not uncomfortable. Luca found that the logic of the game, while not immediately apparent, was not absent. There was something in the spatial relationship between the stones. In the particular way certain configurations made the glow of neighboring stones slightly brighter or slightly softer, that suggested a system he was not fully understanding but was beginning to feel. It was less like learning the rules of a game and more like learning the grammar of a language by immersion, the meaning arriving not through explanation but through repeated exposure until the pattern resolved. At one point, one of Luca's stones dimmed perceptibly. He cupped it as he had seen the man do, both hands briefly, and breathed across it once. The stone brightened. Something about doing this was deeply, unreasonably satisfying. The red-haired man smiled. Not the smile of someone who had won something. The smile of someone who had watched something go correctly. Eventually, the man gathered the stones again and stood, with the same ease and lack of ceremony with which he had sat down, and returned to his table. His companion had poured something into 2 cups while he was gone, and slid one toward him as he sat. He picked it up without looking at it and drank. She said something to him in the language Luca didn't know, low, with a slight question at the end. And he answered in 2 syllables, and she made the sound again that was between a laugh and a sigh, and they were back to themselves, as though nothing had been interrupted. Luca looked at his hands. They were warm, warmer than the room accounted for, warmer than the fire at this distance accounted for. His palms, specifically, where the stones had rested. He turned them over once and looked at them, front and back, and they were entirely ordinary hands, and they were very warm. He was still looking at them when Aino appeared at his side with a second cup. She set it down. Same pottery, same faint redness in the depths when the firelight moved across it, same smell of cardamom and the other thing. And before she could withdraw, he said, because the question had been accumulating for some time, "What is this place?" She paused. She was very good at pausing. She gave the pause the full weight of a pause, not filling it with the preparatory sounds of an answer, not performing consideration. She simply held the pause until it was done. "A café," she said. "I know, but—" "A good one," she said, and there was something in the way she said it, not dismissive, not evasive, but complete, in the way that certain answers were complete, even when they did not answer the question that had been asked. That made him feel the question had in fact been answered, only not in the way he had expected. She moved back toward the counter. Luca looked at the second cup. He looked at the room, at the old man and his book, at the woman drawing her fading lines, at the couple who had gone back to their low music, at the board of stones now back in its place on the other table with its points and its constellations, at the maps on the walls, the jars on the shelves, the dried things hanging from hooks, at the fire, which was doing what it had always been doing. He picked up the second cup with both hands. It was the right temperature. Of course it was. Outside the window, the snow had thickened further. The lane now fully white, the cobblestones gone entirely under it, the lamplight turning the falling snow into something golden and very slow. A wind had come up at some point, and it moved the snow sideways in long, gentle curtains across the lamplight, and then the curtains shifted, and the snow fell straight again, and the lane was white and quiet and entirely still. Luca watched this for a while over the rim of his cup. He was not thinking about tomorrow, or about the hotel, or about when he needed to be back in Helsinki, or about any of the things that ordinarily occupied the background of his mind, the way furniture occupied the background of a room. Noticed only when moved, but always present. He was not thinking about any of that. He was only watching the snow in the lamplight and holding the cup and feeling the warmth of it in both hands, moving from his palms up through his wrists, and the fire was at his left side, and the room was behind him, and everything was at exactly the right distance from everything else. The song, very softly, started again. Chapter 6. What Aino Knew. The room had quieted in the particular way of rooms that had always been quiet, but had now become more so. The old man at the long table had closed his book, or it had closed itself. Luca had not been watching closely enough to be certain, and was sitting with his hands folded on the table in front of him, his eyes resting on some middle distance, with the ease of a person who had long ago made peace with having nothing to do in a given moment. The couple at the back had gone to a silence again, their music set aside the way you set aside something you intended to return to. The young woman at the window was still, her drawing finger resting on the table's edge without moving. Even the fire seemed to have settled into a steadier, lower register, not diminished, only deeper, the kind of burning that happened when the wood had fully caught, and the initial drama of ignition was long past. Luca was on the second half of his second cup. He did not know what time it was. This was an unusual condition for him. He was, at home, a person who knew what time it was with the automatic accuracy of someone whose days were structured enough that the time was always relevant. He had looked at his watch sometime earlier in the evening and found the face of it unhelpful, not because it had stopped, but because the number it showed had failed to connect to any feeling of lateness or earliness or appropriate duration. He had put his wrist back down and not looked again. He was aware of Aino before she sat down. She came from behind the counter. He caught her movement in his peripheral vision and crossed the room without carrying anything, which was new. Every other time she had moved through the room, she had been bringing something, or returning from bringing something. This time her hands were empty, and she moved in the unhurried way she always moved, but with a different quality of intention, a slight directedness that had not been there before. She pulled out the chair across from him, the old burgundy one, the one with the wear patterns, and sat in it with the ease of someone sitting in a chair they had sat in many times. She did not ask if she could join him. She did not need to ask, and both of them seemed to know this without discussing it. She rested her hands on the table, loosely. The silver pendants on her chain settled against her collarbone. He could see them clearly now for the first time. Small leaves, each one slightly different from the others, as though cast from individual originals rather than a single mold. One of them was not a leaf, but something else, too small to identify at this distance, only clearly different. She looked at him in the way she had been looking at him since he arrived, the way that contained something between recognition and amusement, and a third thing he had not yet found a name for. "You walk before you think," she said. It was not a question. It was not said as an observation requiring confirmation. It was said the way you said something you knew, in the same register as stating the weather outside. Luca looked at her. "Most people," she continued, unhurried, her accent light in English, the vowels long in the Finnish way, "they think and then they walk. You walk and thinking comes after, or sometimes it doesn't come at all, and that is also fine with you." He opened his mouth and then closed it. Not because the statement was wrong. It was, in fact, precisely right, the sort of thing he had never articulated to himself, but recognized immediately upon hearing, the way you recognized a piece of music you hadn't heard in years, but because he had no idea how she knew it. "I've never been here before," he said. "We haven't met." "No," she agreed. "So how?" "You came in," she said simply, "and you chose the table nearest the fire, but not closest to it. You sat with your back to the wall. You watched everything before you touched anything. You have been here." She paused, something that might have been amusement moving briefly across her face. "Some time now, and you have not once looked at your phone." He considered this. "That doesn't explain what you said about walking." "Your boots," she said, "are very worn on the outside of the heel. This happens to people who walk the way you do, slightly outward, faster than they mean to, following something they haven't seen yet." She glanced at his hands, resting on the table. "And you have been tapping rhythms since you came in. On the cup, on the table, when Ira was singing." She said this last part without particular emphasis, as though noting a detail that required no special comment. People who tap rhythms do not usually know they are doing it. They are processing something. You process by moving. Luca looked at his hands. He had not known the singing woman's name was Ira. "That's very observant," he said. "Yes," she said, without false modesty, which he found he appreciated. Then, "You also have a habit of looking to your left before you answer a question." He became immediately aware that he was looking to his left. He brought his eyes back. She was watching him with the warmth of someone who had made a small joke and found it had landed gently, which was the best way for small jokes to land. "There is something you have not told anyone," she said. Her voice was the same, quiet even, without drama. Not a secret exactly, more like something that happened to you, and then you put it somewhere and have been walking past the place where you put it for a long time. The fire shifted in the grate, a small movement, a settling. Luca did not answer immediately. He looked at the second cup, almost empty now, the last of the redness in its depths catching the candlelight. And then he looked at Aino, and she was looking back at him with an expression that was patient in the specific way of someone who was not waiting for an answer, but simply making room for one in case it wanted to come. It was this, more than anything else she had said, that was the strangest thing. She was not asking him to tell her. She had simply named the thing and left it there. the way you might set an object on a table and step back from it, neither requiring that it be picked up, nor suggesting that it wouldn't be. There was an afternoon, Luca said slowly. A few years ago. He stopped. I don't know why I'm telling you this. You don't have to, she said. And she meant it. He could hear that she meant it, the way certain people made their meaning legible beyond the words. No, He paused. There was an afternoon in a city I hadn't been to before. I was alone. Nothing happened. I mean, nothing happened. I walked around, I had coffee, I watched people from a bench for a long time. And I felt something. I don't know what it was. I have never been able to explain it to anyone, because nothing happened. There was nothing to explain. He looked at the cup. But I've thought about it often. More than things that did happen. Aino was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone formulating a response. The quiet of someone letting something be what it was before anything else was added to it. Yes, she said finally. Those afternoons are the ones that stay. She said it simply, without weight, the way you confirmed a direction rather than revealed a truth. But something in him settled at hearing it. Settled in the same way the thing from the plate had settled, a returning to a correct register. Something brought back to where it belonged. He looked at her. How do you know that? I have had many afternoons, she said. Her eyes in the candlelight were a color he found difficult to fix. Not quite grey, not quite green, changing slightly depending on where the light was coming from, like the surface of water changing with the sky above it. She wore no expression that he could summarize easily. She wore something more like a weather, changeable but coherent, always itself. You think better here than in most places, she said, shifting, the way she shifted everything, without warning and without abruptness. Most people do. There is something about the air in here. What is it? Old, she said. The air in here is very old. It has been breathed many times, and it knows what it is for. She said this without any evident sense that it was an unusual thing to say, and somehow, in this room, it wasn't. You have been walking for 2 hours outside in air that is very new. Finnish winter air in December is very new. It is good, but it is new. This is different. Luca thought about this. He thought about new air and old air and the difference between them, and found, to his slight surprise, that the distinction made immediate sense to him. He had felt it when he came in, the weight and character of the warmth, the way it had come out to meet him at the door. He had thought it was the contrast with the cold, but perhaps it was something else, or something more. Have you been here a long time? He asked. Running this place? She considered the question in her way, giving it the full pause it required. Long enough, she said, that I have stopped counting. He looked around the room, the old man with his closed book, the young woman with her still finger at the table's edge, the couple with their resumed nearness, the board of stones at the other table, the glow of each stone steady in the candlelight. The others, he said, the people here tonight, do they come regularly? When they need to, Aino said. And when it is time. Is it time for me? She looked at him for a moment, the weather of her expression moving through something he couldn't read, and then she did something he hadn't seen her do before. She smiled fully. Not the small near smile she had worn for most of the evening, but an actual smile, warm and complete and without reservation. "You came in out of the cold," she said, "and you sat down, and you held the cup with both hands." She paused. Yes, it was time. Then she stood, with the same unhurried ease with which she had sat, and gathered his empty cup from the table with one hand and looked at him once more before she turned toward the counter. "There is a little more of the evening left," she said. "Rest in it." And she walked back to the counter, and the pendants on her chain moved with her, and the candlelight moved with her movement, and then settled, and Luca sat in the chair with the fire at his left side, and the room behind him, and the snow at the window, and what she had said still in the air around him, resting in it, which was exactly what she had told him to do. He looked at his hands again, still warm from the stones, from the cup, from the old air of the room. Outside, the snow fell in long, slow curtains through the lamplight. He did not look at his watch. He was not going to look at his watch. He let his shoulders drop, which they had been doing on their own for some time, and he let his eyes go soft and unfocused in the way of eyes that were content to receive whatever came to them rather than seeking anything out. And the room received him in this state with the same quiet accommodation it had shown since the beginning. And the fire went on burning with its deep, unhurried competence, and somewhere behind him, and to the right, very softly, someone began to hum. Chapter 7. When the fire got closer. At some point, without deciding to, Luca had moved his chair. Not far, only slightly, a few inches toward the fire, the way you adjusted your position without fully waking to the decision, the body making its small negotiations with comfort while the mind was occupied elsewhere. He noticed this the way he noticed the fire itself, not as new information, but as something that had already been true for a while and was only now registering. The left side of his face was warm. His left hand, resting on the arm of the chair, was warm. The warmth had a quality to it that was different from the warmth of the room generally. It had direction, a source. It came from somewhere specific and arrived at him with the patient insistence of something that had been traveling toward him for a long time and had finally closed the distance. He let it. The room behind him was the room it had always been. He was aware of it the way you were aware of a room you had been sitting in for long enough that it had stopped being a new thing and had become simply the context of everything else. The low sounds of it, the occasional shift of wood in the grate, the near inaudible movement of Aino behind the counter, doing whatever she was doing, the breath of the room itself, which was a thing he had begun to notice. Not air conditioning, not ventilation, only the very slow movement of old warm air in a space that had contained it for a long time. He noticed these things, and then he stopped noticing them in the way of stopping. That was not absence, but accommodation. They had moved from the category of things being perceived to the category of things simply present, which was a different category, lower and quieter, requiring less of him. His shoulders were at a height he did not maintain in ordinary life. He was aware of this in the distant, informational way. He was aware of several things now. aware without the awareness requiring any particular response. In ordinary life, his shoulders were where they were because there was always something to be ready for, some small preparedness that expressed itself through the body before the mind had committed to it. Here, there was nothing to be ready for. The fire was there. The chair was correct. The room was what it was. His shoulders understood this and had drawn their own conclusions. The humming from somewhere behind him was still present. The same voice that had begun after Aino returned to the counter, low and without melody in the formal sense, more like a sound the room was making than a sound a person was making. Or perhaps the distinction between those two things had become less clear in the last little while. He noticed the fire without looking at it directly. This was a thing you could do with fires. Look slightly to one side and receive the fire in your peripheral vision, where it had a different quality than when looked at straight on. In the center of vision, the fire was specific. Individual flames, particular movements, the orange and yellow and occasional blue at the base, where the wood was hottest. In the periphery, it was something else, only warmth and light and movement. The impression of a fire rather than a fire's details. And in some ways, this was more the truth of a fire than the details were. He had read something once about how peripheral vision was older, evolutionarily older, built for detecting movement rather than examining objects, tuned to the world before the world had objects worth examining closely. He had found this interesting at the time, and then forgotten it, and it had come back to him now. Here, without particular reason, the way certain things came back in warm rooms. He let it come and did not try to think it further. The food on the small plate was gone. He did not remember finishing it, only that the plate was empty, and the warmth that had come from the thing on it was now inside him, distributed evenly, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with whatever he had eaten. His chest, his hands, a point somewhere below his sternum that was warm in a way that was not entirely physical, that belonged to the category of warm that certain conversations produced and certain places produced, and that he had not, until this evening, found in a café. Aino passed through his peripheral vision, moving from left to right behind the counter, her pale hair catching the candlelight as she turned to reach something on the shelf. The pendants on her chain moved. She reached something. One of the jars, dark glass, its contents not visible from here, and turned back with it and set it on the counter and opened it with both hands, and whatever was inside, it released a smell that reached him a moment later. Something green and cold and old, like a forest in the moment just before rain, like the smell of earth that had been covered and uncovered many times. It mixed with the cardamom already in the air. The two smells did not conflict. They occupied different registers. The cardamom warm and low, the green thing cool and high. And between them they filled the air with something that had no single name, but that the body recognized as correct, as belonging to a category of air that was good to breathe in a room where one had decided to stay. He breathed in. His eyes were not closed and were not fully open. They held a position between the two that was not drowsiness, only the natural position of eyes that had stopped looking for anything and were simply open in a room. The fire in his peripheral vision moved in its unhurried way. The candle on his table. He could see it directly, just at the edge of his forward vision, held its flame very still, as it had since he arrived. Candles in a room with air movement flickered. This one did not flicker. He had noticed this earlier, and then forgotten it, and was noticing it again now with the mild, undemanding interest of someone who had arrived at a place beyond surprise. The stones on the other table glowed. He could see them from here. The board with its constellation pattern, the small stones arranged in whatever configuration the last move had left them in. Their glow was steady and internal, the same quiet light he had held in his hands. He thought about the warmth of them in his palms. He could still feel it, or feel the memory of it, which was in some ways the same. The hands holding the afterimage of warmth, the way the eye held the afterimage of light. The humming shifted slightly, not the melody, only the timbre of it. A small internal change, as though the person humming had exhaled deeply and resumed on the other side of the breath. Luca's hands were in his lap. He was not holding anything. The cup was on the table, empty. Or he thought it was empty. He had not looked at it recently. His hands in his lap were warm and still, and he felt the weight of them with an unusual clarity, the specific gravity of hands at rest, which was a thing he had almost no experience of. His hands at rest in ordinary life were not at rest. They were only waiting, holding tension for the next use. These hands were simply resting. The distinction was legible in the body, even if it was not easily put into words. He thought briefly about the afternoon he had told Aino about, not thinking it through, not examining it, not trying to understand it any better than he already had or hadn't, only holding it lightly, the way you held something small and fragile, not gripping, only present with it. The afternoon in the city he hadn't known. The bench, the coffee, which had been fine, but had not been this. The feeling he had not been able to explain to anyone because there was no event attached to it, only the feeling itself, which had turned out to be enough to last for years. Aino had said, "Those afternoons are the ones that stay." He had known this, of course, had known it in the way of knowing things that had not yet been confirmed by language. Hearing her say it had not told him something he didn't know. It had only moved the thing from one place to another, from the unspoken place to the spoken one, and the spoken place was somehow easier to carry. He let the thought settle and did not follow it further. The fire in the grate made a sound, a slow exhalation of wood, a minor collapse of something that had been burning long enough to become something else. Not alarming. The sound of continuance rather than interruption. The sound of a process going forward. He noticed that he had not thought about the walk back to the hotel. Not that he had thought about it and dismissed it. It had simply not appeared. The cold of the lane outside, the snow on the cobblestones, the distance between here and his room, the question of which streets to take. None of it had visited him. He was aware, now that he was looking for it, that these thoughts existed somewhere, that they would reassemble themselves when the time came for them. But the time had not come. The time was some other time, not this one. And this one had its own requirements, which were considerably simpler. Be in the chair, let the fire be there, let the room be the room. He could do this. He found he was already doing it. The smell from the jar Aino had opened, the green, cold forest smell, had integrated now with the cardamom, the two of them no longer separately identifiable, but become a third thing, the air of the room in its current state, specific to this hour, to this configuration of fire and candle and warm old stone and the breath of the people in it. He breathed it in again without trying to name it. Outside the window, he could see it from here, the small pane of old imperfect glass. The snow was still falling. The lamplight in the lane gave it color, gold at the top of each flake's descent where it caught the light fully, fading through amber to the near white of its landing. The cobblestones were completely invisible now. The lane was only snow and lamp, and the dark shapes of buildings on either side, holding their heat inside their old wood walls. He watched the snow for a while. He was not sure how long. Time in this room continued to behave as it had been behaving, present but not pressing, not moving with the ordinary urgency of time in ordinary rooms. It was there the way the fire was there, doing what it did, not requiring his management. His left hand lifted from his lap. He was not sure why. It moved to the arm of the chair and rested there in the warmth from the fire, and he felt the difference immediately. The warmth specific and present on his palm and fingers, a warmth with a texture to it, not uniform but varying slightly as the fire moved. The small fluctuations of it legible against his skin. He let his hand rest there. Somewhere in the room, very softly, a second voice joined the humming, lower than the first, finding a note beneath it that the first voice had left space for, and the two of them together became something that was not quite music and not quite not, existing in the interval between those categories, the way the room itself existed in the interval between ordinary places and whatever else it was. Luca's eyes were still open. He was still in the chair. The fire was still there. Aino was still behind the counter, moving in her unhurried way. The candle on his table held its still flame. He was aware of all of this in the way of being aware of your own breathing, not requiring thought, not requiring attention, simply present as a condition of being there. The warmth from the fire moved along his hand and up his wrist. He noticed this, and then he stopped noticing it, and it was simply there, simply part of the temperature of his arm, which was the temperature of the room, which was the temperature of the evening, which was warm, which was enough, which was. The second voice held its low note. The snow fell through the lamplight outside. The candle flame was very still. Chapter 8. Amber. All the way down. The fire. The fire and the warmth from it, which had been moving up his arm for some time now, and had reached his shoulder and stopped there, or had not stopped there, but had become indistinguishable from his shoulder, from the warmth of his own body at rest in the chair, so that the boundary between the heat that was him and the heat that was the fire had become a question without a clear answer, and the question had stopped mattering some time ago. The room was amber, not a thought about the room itself, the color of it, the quality of light from the candles, and the fire working together on the dark wood of the walls and the floor and the ceiling beams, producing between them a warmth of color that was not any single amber, but all the ambers, the whole range from the pale amber of the candle flames themselves through the deeper amber of the wood to the darkest amber at the far edges of the room, where the firelight thinned and the candlelight had given up, and the room kept its own counsel in the comfortable dark. The pendants on Aino's chain caught it as she moved. Small flashes, each one brief and specific, the light finding the silver and holding it for a fraction of a second before the movement continued and the silver turned away. She was behind the counter, then she was not behind the counter, then she was somewhere at the edge of things, moving with the quality of movement that was not quiet, because it was careful, but quiet because it was entirely in accordance with the room, the way water was quiet when it moved with the contour of the ground beneath it. The humming had changed again. It was lower now, both voices lower, as though the room had gently asked them to come down, and they had obliged without discussion. The melody, if it had ever been a melody in the strict sense, had dissolved into something more like a texture, a sonic warmth that occupied the same space as the air, that was in the air the way the cardamom was in the air, not located exactly, but present everywhere at once. The stones on the other table, their glow, steady, internal, the color of something warm seen through something thin, the board with its constellation lines between them, each stone at its position, each contributing its small light to the whole. The whole was more than the sum of the stones. The whole was a warmth of light that had nothing to do with the candles and nothing to do with the fire, and existed in its own quiet category, the category of things that generated what they needed from inside themselves. His hands in his lap were the temperature of the room, or the room was the temperature of his hands. The distinction had the same quality as the fire and shoulder question, technically meaningful, practically irrelevant. His hands were warm, the room was warm. The boundary between the warm of one and the warm of the other was academic, and the body had no interest in academics tonight. The old man at the long table was still. Not asleep, still in a different way, the way of someone who had arrived at a state of rest so complete that the categories of awake and asleep had become beside the point. His hands on the table, his hat brim in its particular shadow, the closed book in front of him, its cover the material that was not quite leather and not quite cloth, receiving the candlelight and neither reflecting nor absorbing it, but doing something between the two that produced a warmth on its surface. The young woman at the window, her hand resting at the table's edge, the window above her with its old glass and the snow outside it, the lamplight in the lane turning the falling snow gold at the top of its descent, amber at the middle, white at the landing. She was not drawing. Her eyes were resting on the glass, on the snow, on something beyond the snow, or before it, or inside it, on whatever a person's eyes rested on when they had let them go, to the place eyes went when no longer asked to do anything particular. The back of Luca's neck was warm. The chair's high back rose above his shoulders, and the warmth that came from the room pressed gently from behind, from the ambient heat of a space that had been heated for a long time, that had stone walls, that had absorbed warmth across years and returned it slowly, that had wood floors that held the memory of fires in their grain, The warmth from behind and the warmth from the fire at his left made of him something that was fully surrounded, fully held at the correct temperature, a thing in its right environment. The second cup was empty, or had been empty. It was on the table, and it had the quality of emptiness that cups had when they had been empty for a while, and had stopped being about their contents and become simply objects, simply the cream pottery and the thin gold line of the repaired crack catching the candlelight in its long, unhurried seam. The smell of the room was very deep now. Cardamom and the forest smell and the fire and something beneath all of those, the smell of old stone and old wood and old warmth that was the room's own smell, the smell it had regardless of what was being prepared or burned, the smell of a place that had been itself for a long time and knew it. He breathed it in, and it filled him at the same rate the warmth had filled him, gradually and then completely, leaving no room for anything colder. Aino moved through the room. She came from the direction of the counter, from somewhere in the amber, and she moved between the tables in her way, her pale hair holding light at its edges, the pendants at her throat catching and releasing their small flashes. She did not stop at any table. She was passing through the room the way the warmth passed through it, not directed at anything, only moving, only present. She passed his table. Her hand came down on his shoulder, very lightly, the weight of it barely more than the weight of the pendants when they swung, a contact so brief and so quiet that it existed at the edge of whether it had happened at all. But it was warm. Her hand was warm in a way that was different from the warmth of the room and the warmth of the fire, specific and knowing, the warmth of a hand that had been exactly this warm for a very long time and knew what to do with it. Then she was gone, past him, toward the back of the room, her movement continuing as it had been, unhurried and entirely itself, his shoulder where her hand had been, warm, simply warm, in the specific location of her touch, a warmth that remained after the hand was gone, the way the warmth of stones remained in the palm after the stones were set back on the board. He did not think about this. The warmth was there, and it was enough to be there without thinking about it. The voices, the humming, the two of them, were very low now. They were at the threshold of hearing, which was a place sound had its own character, not quiet in the way of quietness that was the absence of sound, but quiet in the way of sound that had descended to the level where the ear stopped working hard to receive it and simply let it arrive. The two voices at that level, the fire at that level, the breath of the room at that level, all of it very low and very present, a warmth of sound the way the light was a warmth of color. The amber of the room went all the way down. Not a metaphor, a fact of the firelight, the way it fell on everything and went into it, into the grain of the wood floors, into the plaster of the walls, into the wool of the chairs and the pottery of the cups and the pages of the old man's closed book and the surface of the board with its glowing stones and the glass of the window with its snow and the pendants on Aino's chain, and the dried sprig of ivory flowers at the edge of his table that was still there, still and pale, its small flowers receiving the light without giving it back. His hands, warm, still, in his lap, resting with no ambition. The fire and the amber, it made of everything. The amber that went all the way to the edges of the room and into the comfortable dark beyond the edges. And the dark, there was not cold dark, but amber dark, the dark that amber made when it thinned to its end, warm even in its absence. The snow at the window, falling, gold at the top of the descent, amber in the middle, white at the landing, over and over, each flake completing its small arc, replaced by another, the repetition of it not monotonous, but the opposite of monotonous, deeply, specifically itself, doing what it did with a consistency that was not mechanical, but natural, the consistency of things that did not need to vary, because they were already exactly what they were. The candle on his table, flame very still. The couple at the back, their nearness, their quiet, the specific warmth of two people who had been beside each other long enough to have given up the performance of being beside each other and had arrived at the thing itself. Aino somewhere in the room, in the amber, the pendants, the pale hair, the movement that was in accordance with the room. The old man, still. The young woman, still. The stones, glowing. The fire, warm. The left side of his face, warm. His left hand on the arm of the chair, warm. His shoulder where her hand had been warm. His chest where the warmth from the food had gone warm. His hands in his lap, warm. The temperature of the room, the temperature of the air he was breathing, the temperature of the amber light falling on everything without distinction, on him and on the cup, and on the dried flowers, and on the snow outside the window, catching the lamplight and falling through it and landing over and over, quietly, each one complete. The humming, very low, almost the room's own sound. His eyes, open, receiving what they received without seeking it, the fire at the edge of what they could see, the candle flame very still, the amber of everything, the warmth. Everywhere the warmth. His breathing, which was slow, which had been slow for some time, which had arrived at a rate that was simply the correct rate for a body at rest, in a room that was warm, that had been warm, that would go on being warm, in the amber, in the low sound, in the old air that had been breathed and knew what it was for. He was in the chair. The room was the room. The fire was the fire. This was enough. This was. The warmth moving through him with each breath, the amber on every surface, the low voices doing what they did, the snow at the window doing what it did, the stones doing what they did. This was without question, without argument, without any requirement of explanation or justification. More than enough. All the way down. Chapter 9. Snow on the glass. Fire. Snow. Snow on the glass. The lamplight in the lane, turning it gold at the top of its falling, then amber, then white at the landing, then more snow, from above, gold again, beginning again. The fire at the left side of everything, at the left side of the room, and the left side of his face, and the left side of the air between him and the window, where the snow was falling. The fire doing what it had always been doing. the fire not requiring anything. The old imperfect glass, with its small bubbles and its slight thickenings, the glass that had been here long enough to develop its own relationship with light, its own way of receiving what came through it and giving it back slightly changed, slightly warmer, slightly more itself. The snow outside it, the lamplight outside it, both of them doing what they did on the other side of the glass, in the cold that was out there and staying out there. The fire here, warm. The candle flame on his table, very still, the way it had been still since he arrived, the way it would be still after. A stillness that was not the absence of movement, but a movement so slow and so constant that it read as stillness, the way certain rivers looked still from a distance because they were moving entirely at their own pace and not in response to anything. Snow, gold, amber, white, gold again. Each flake complete, each flake its own small arc from the dark above the lamplight, down through the gold of the lamplight, and out the other side into the white of the lane, where it landed and became part of the white, indistinguishable, at rest. The fire, a sound from it, very small, the sound of wood that had been burning long enough to know what it was doing, a minor interior rearrangement, a settling further into itself. Then the sound was gone, and the fire went on. The amber of the room, all the way to the edges, all the way into the dark at the edges, which was amber dark, warm dark, the dark that the fire made when it reached as far as it could reach and then thinned to nothing, leaving only the color of having been there. The humming, very low, at the level where sound and silence were the same thing, where the ear had stopped distinguishing between them and was simply receiving whatever arrived. Or perhaps the humming had stopped. Or perhaps it was still there and he had become part of it, which was the same as it stopping, which was the same as it never stopping. The difference between those things no longer available to him in any useful way. Snow on the glass, still falling, had been falling, would go on falling in the particular patient way of Finnish snow in December, which did not hurry and did not accumulate with drama, but simply continued, flake by flake, each one doing its small part. The lane going whiter by degrees too fine to observe directly, only to notice after the fact, looking and finding it whiter than the last time you looked, without having seen it become so. The stones on the other table, glowing, steady, warm from inside. His hands, warm, in his lap, still. The amber, the candle very still. His breathing, slow, arriving at the pace that was simply the pace of a body that had stopped negotiating with the room and had become part of it, breathing the old warm air and returning it slightly warmer, slightly more breathed, part of the long chain of breath that had been exchanged in this room, across however long the room had been itself. Gold, amber, the fire, somewhere in the room, behind him, at the far warm edge of the amber, the sound of Aino moving, not footsteps, only the small displacement of air that a person made when they moved through a room they knew entirely, the barely perceptible shift in the warmth, the pendants catching light for a fraction of a second, and then not, then stillness, then the fire, then the snow on the glass, falling, gold at the top, amber in the middle, white at the landing, and more behind it and more behind that, patient and complete, each one doing exactly what it came to do and no more. The candle. Still. The room. Warm. Snow. Fire. The amber all the way down, all the way to the edges, all the way into the corners where the light thinned and the warmth remained, where everything that had been in this room this evening had gone to rest. The sounds, the smells, the warmth of the stones in his palms, the weight of Aino's hand on his shoulder, the song in the language he didn't know, the taste of the coffee that had been exactly right, all of it settling into the amber at the edges of the room, into the old warm dark that held things, into the room's long memory of evenings. His eyes receiving what they received, the fire at the left side of everything, warm, doing what it had always been doing, not requiring anything, not ending. Snow on the glass, still. Chapter 10. The corner where it had been. The morning was very clear. The snow had stopped sometime in the night, and the sky above Porvoo was the particular blue of winter mornings after snowfall. Not the blue of summer, not the blue of open water, but something paler and more considered. A blue that had been arrived at through cold and was aware of it. The light was clean and came from everywhere at once, reflected off the snow on every surface, and it made the old town look like something seen through glass that had been very carefully cleaned. Luca had slept well. He was aware of this as a fact rather than a surprise. He had fallen asleep quickly and without the usual negotiations, without the half hour of lying in the dark, running the day backward through his mind. And he had woken without the heaviness that sometimes followed a night of sleeping in an unfamiliar room. He had woken, and the room had been light, and he had lain still for a while, looking at the ceiling, and the ceiling of the hotel room was white and low and unremarkable, and he had looked at it with a quality of attention that he recognized as the attention of the morning after something. Not sadness, not loss. Something that was the quieter relative of both. The particular feeling of a person who had been somewhere and was now somewhere else, carrying it. He dressed slowly. He ate breakfast in the small hotel dining room without tasting it especially. He drank the coffee they brought him, which was fine, which was coffee, which bore no relationship to what he had drunk last night in any category, except the most literal. He put on his coat and went outside. The cold was the same cold, dry and still, and carrying the smell of frozen air and something older than frozen air. His boots on the fresh snow made a sound that was entirely different from the sound they had made on the wet cobblestones last night. Quieter, softer, each step absorbed rather than returned. He walked through the main street of the old town, past the cafes that were beginning to open, their windows steaming in the morning cold, and he turned off the embankment at the bridge and went up into the old streets that climbed the hill. He found the lane without difficulty. This surprised him slightly. He had half expected the lane to present the same ambiguity it had last night, the uncertainty of whether it was there or had always been there, or was there only under certain conditions. But in the morning light, it was simply a lane, narrow between two rows of old buildings, the snow undisturbed along its length in the way of snow, in a place that received little foot traffic. His own footprints entering it from this end were the first marks on the white. He walked to the end. The building at the end of the lane was red-painted wood, as the other buildings were, with 2 windows on its upper story, both dark, reflecting the pale winter sky. The lower portion of the wall was unbroken. No door, no small pane of old, imperfect glass, no iron bracket where a wooden sign might hang. Only the red wood, the paint slightly faded in the way of paint that had been through many winters, and the snow banked gently against the base of the wall in an undisturbed line. He stood in front of it for a while. He was not looking for evidence. He was not running through explanations or testing hypotheses or doing any of the things he might otherwise have done when confronted with something that did not resolve. He was simply standing where he was standing, looking at the wall in the clean winter light, and the wall was what it was: red wood and old paint, and snow at its base, and the pale sky above, and it was complete in the way that walls were complete. Nothing missing from it, nothing where a door should have been, because there was no should have been, only the wall as it was. He looked at it for another moment. Then he looked down. At the base of the wall, in the snow, at approximately the place where a threshold might have been, a single small thing, a sprig of something dried, pale-stemmed, with tiny flowers along it, the color of old ivory, lying in the snow as though it had been placed there, or as though it had simply arrived in the way that small things arrived in the corners of old buildings, carried by the air. He looked at it for a long time. He did not pick it up. It seemed right where it was, half in shadow, half in the cold morning light, its small ivory flowers very still against the white of the snow, precisely itself, asking nothing. He straightened. He put his hands in his pockets and stood for another moment in the lane, in the clear winter morning, with the pale blue sky above the rooftops, and the snow undisturbed around him, and the red wall in front of him, and the dried sprig at its base. And he breathed in once the frozen air, the old stone, the particular smell of Porvoo in December, and breathed out. Then he turned and walked back down the lane. His footprints in the snow going in were there, and he walked back through them, his feet finding the same impressions, slightly deepening them. The lane behind him was quiet. He did not look back, not because there was nothing to look back at. The wall was there, the sprig was there, the morning was there, but because the looking had already been done, fully, and what was needed now was only to carry it forward into whatever the day held. He reached the end of the lane and turned onto the street. The town was waking around him, a woman with a bag of groceries crossing the bridge, a light coming on in a window above a dark shop, the sound of a car somewhere beyond the old streets, ordinary and unhurried. The river below the bridge held its thin ice along the edges and its dark water in the middle. The snow on the embankment railing was still clean and unbroken. He walked. His steps on the fresh snow were quiet, quieter than they needed to be, softer than the surface required. He noticed this and did not adjust them. Somewhere above the rooftops, a bird crossed the pale sky, very small, very direct, going somewhere it knew how to find. On his left wrist, caught in the cuff of his coat, where the wool had held it through the night and through the cold morning air, the faintest trace of cardamom, not enough to be certain of, only enough to be present, the ghost of a smell, the memory of a warmth, the remainder of a room that had been exactly itself and had known, apparently, exactly when to let him go. He walked on through the snow. The sky above Porvoo was very clear. The cold was the same cold, doing what it always did. And somewhere in the way his steps fell, softly, a little slower than usual, a little more deliberate, as though some part of him was still in no particular hurry to arrive. Something of the evening remained, quiet and unhurried, and not requiring a name, moving forward with him into the clean white morning.